Hey everyone. This is a chapter from Karl Kautsky in the Socialist Revolution, 1880 to 1938. And this is chapter 9 of the book, The Class Character of the USSR. I don't know how much of this book I'm actually going to read, but I am going to read the sections that are post 1917, just to get a feel for Kautsky's commentary on the nature of the Soviet Union. And this chapter is titled The Class Character of the USSR. And the first section is called The Polemic with Bauer, Adler, Dan, and Abramovich. Kautsky's increasingly and systematically hostile assessment of Bolshevism and of the prospects of the USSR brought him into conflict with some of the most distinguished representatives of international, quote, Menshevism. Regarding the Soviet regime as economically and politically anti-proletarian, Kautsky concluded that it must be overthrown. There was no other way forward for socialism in Russia. In other words, Kautsky denied that Bolshevism represented a primitive, quote, variant of contemporary socialism corresponding to Russia's socioeconomic backwardness, and therefore one of the, quote, possible roads for laying the foundations for an advanced socialism. Kautsky likewise denied that Bolshevism could be, quote, reformed, and these views led to a direct clash with the Russian Mensheviks Dan and Abramovich, and with the Austro-Marxist Fritz Adler and Otto Bauer. Otto Bauer, the most authoritative of the Austro-Marxists, had clearly stated his own position in Bolshevism oder Sozialdemokratie, a pamphlet published in 1920. In this work, Otto Bauer concurred with Kautsky in rejecting the Bolshevik claim that the Russian model could be applied in the West, but he parted company with Kautsky in insisting that there could be different roads to socialism in the East and the West, equally suitable to the historic mission of the liberation of the local proletariat. The Bolsheviks, Otto Bauer wrote, had shown the, quote, working class a different path to its goal, the violent constitution of a brutally overt class rule by the proletariat, end quote. Otto Bauer. The Social Democratic road, on the other hand, Otto Bauer, that's from Bolshevismus oder Sozialdemokratie, published in 1920. So that's 1920 that quote's from. The Social Democratic road, on the other hand, corresponded to the historical and social conditions in countries that were more developed than Russia. Bauer and his fellow thinkers argued that any insurrection against the Bolsheviks would open the door not to the development of socialism, but to counter-revolutionary action in Russia. They held that despite its, quote, barbaric methods, Bolshevism was laying the basis through its modernization of the Russian economy for a new rise of democratic socialism in the future. Finally, they believed that for all its negative aspects, Bolshevism remained a genuinely socialist force linked to the proletariat. Kautsky profoundly disagreed with this approach. Having identified the democratic and socialist roads by definition, he denied that Bolshevism had any socialist character whatever. His opponents, pointing to the objective effects of economic modernization and industrialization on the future weight of the Soviet working class, emphasized the socio-economic importance of the proletariat as a class within the Bolshevik Party from its very origins. They were convinced that the function of Bolshevism would in the final analysis prove progressive. It cannot be equated with reaction and combated as such. Confronted with the depth of this disagreement, Kautsky charged that Bauer and others remained prisoners of a merely economistic and sociologizing analysis. Kautsky insisted that any assessment of Bolshevism must be based on a judgment of Bolshevism's political instruments as the concrete expressions of the system it had created. If socialism employed the same instruments as capitalism, then there was no point in replacing capitalism with socialism. For socialists, a change in the infrastructure was only a means to create new social relations, and not an end in itself. If a socialist infrastructure were unable to generate a new pattern of social relations, then the struggle of the working class would lose all meaning. In fact, of course, Kautsky considered Bolshevism worse than the system it had succeeded. It should not be assumed that the development of the productive forces by the new regime would prove in any way superior to the performance of a Russian capitalism, or better yet, an advanced progressive democracy such as the Bolsheviks had extinguished by dissolving the Constituent Assembly after the victorious coup d'etat. Otto Bauer had written that, quote, the Bolsheviks are undoubtedly a party supported by a section of the Russian proletariat, an unquestionably revolutionary and socialist party, end quote, and that for this reason, quote, in spite of all our differences, end quote, it was necessary to acknowledge a common loyalty to socialism and a, quote, community of interest, end quote, with them. In 1925, Kautsky replied that this had been his own opinion at one time, but that he had since been compelled to revise it, for it was now clear that the fundamental feature of the Bolshevik regime was not the static fact that it rested on part of the proletariat, but the dynamic process of its fragmentation of the proletariat as a class and formation of a section of it into a Praetorian Guard of a government that was anti-proletarian as a whole. This was a most serious crime committed by those who were supposed to lead the entire class in its self-emancipation. Kautsky declared that the conflict between himself and Bauer mirrored the earlier conflict that divided Martov from the Mensheviks, from other Mensheviks like Axelrod. Yeah. No thank you. Where the hell am I? In 1928 and 1929, Kautsky wrote 2 articles on the relationship between the goals of social democracy and of communism. Kautsky's aim was to contest the position officially adopted at the Toulouse Congress of the French Socialists that, quote, the final goal, end quote, of the 2 movements was identical. Kautsky claimed that the similarity lay merely in word and not in deed. Quote, it is true that Bolshevism, like social democracy, speaks of the liberation of the proletariat. But Bolshevism, contrary to Marx, does not expect that the proletariat will ever attain the capacity to emancipate itself. An elite, namely a workers', quote, vanguard, must accomplish this task in the name of the entire class, end quote. Kautsky. Thereby rendering the working class, quote, ever less capable of liberating itself, end quote. Kautsky. To provide a foundation for these views, Kautsky turned to the problem of the social nature of the USSR and the significance of the USSR's nationalization of the means of production, which could not, he argued, be identified with the socialization proper to Marxism. Quote, where the state apparatus is an instrument in the hands of a minority for the subjugation of the great majority of the people, any nationalization of the means of production intensifies the despotism of this minority and enhances servitude of the toiling masses. A process of nationalization undertaken by a state of this type represents the opposite of the sort to which we aspire, ... Under the model state of communist Russia, the state ... is identified not with the nation but with a party that includes not more than 1% of the population, which is in turn completely dependent on a ruling clique. In effect, then, the means of production have become the private property of this ruling clique, which disposes of them at its will, ... The nationalization that we seek, therefore, has nothing in common with that of Bolshevism. What we have in common is only the word nationalization, but not the thing, end quote. Kautsky, 1929. Pursuing his polemics with Bauer in 1931, Kautsky emphatically reiterated his conception of democracy and socialism. What was in question, Kautsky said, was precisely whether the relationship between the two could be contingent. Was a non-democratic road to socialism conceivable? Kautsky hotly denied the possibility. It was clear that if a thesis like Bauer's became current in international social democracy, the entire edifice of Kautsky's position, based on the assumption that an undemocratic road to socialism led not to the preparation of a later democratic revival of socialism, but to its negation, will be exposed to collapse. Even more so his conclusion that Bolshevism could not be reformed, and so must be brought down by a proletarian revolution, aimed primarily at restoration of political democracy, resuming the brief experiment cut short in October 1917. In a speech to the Congress of the Socialist International held in Vienna in July 1931, Bauer presented his analysis. Quote, "There are various roads to socialism. These roads include the road of violence, dictatorship, and terror, which the world historical example of the Russian Revolution is rendered enticing to great masses of workers in all countries. Yes, we will not deny that in this manner, too, it is possible to take the means of production from the capitalists, to break the monopoly of property and education commanded by the possessing classes. We will not deny that the attempt to supplant capitalist anarchy with the planned organization of social production can be undertaken in this way." End quote. Bauer, however, went on to argue that the price of such a, quote, dictatorial road was total political despotism that annihilated individual and collective freedoms, and concluded that it must not be taken in the developed countries. Quote, "This path of violence, of dictatorship, of terror is not ours. It is not the roads that we desire. It's not the road that we desire. We do not want to renounce democracy and the political self-determination of the people in the name of socialism. Rather, we seek to posit this democracy and self-determination as the very basis of the construction of a socialist society." End quote. Otto Bauer. There was something more in Bauer's speech which related to the future strategy of the labor movement in the developed countries. Bauer maintained that the political option of the socialist forces in the West ought to be the democratic road, but at the same time Bauer declared that if the bourgeoisie attempted to enslave the proletariat by the installation of fascism, then the working class would pursue the struggle for socialism, quote, "even through means other," end quote, "than those of democracy." In sum, although Bauer's speech indicated preference for the democratic, it did not exclude an undemocratic road. Bauer thus lent general strategic legitimacy to the possibility of building socialism with the instruments of, quote, dictatorship, and therewith sanctioned the socialist credentials of the Bolshevik dictatorship. Kautsky's reaction was sharp. Kautsky's reaction was sharp. Kautsky did not accept the possibility that there were, quote, different roads to socialism, end quote, since some which violated the obligatory connection between democracy and socialism. For Kautsky, there could only be different applications of democracy. Kautsky insisted that the struggle against fascism must be a struggle to reassert the democratic method as essential to socialism, which could never be attained by an undemocratic road. Dictatorship was a too potent medicine that would infallibly destroy not only reaction, but also the revolution, paving the way, regardless of its intentions, for an anti-proletarian regime, since the only mode in which the proletariat could express itself politically was democracy, both under the capitalist system and even more so under a socialist system. Violence could be used only to reconquer democracy. He reasoned that if the proletariat had not been strong enough to prevent the fascist degeneration of the bourgeoisie, all the less would it be strong enough to establish a regime of its own. This was a variant of the position he had held in the years before 1914 on the possibility of responding to a declaration of war with strikes to paralyze production. Such was Kautsky's response to Bauer's, quote, oscillations and, quote, contradictions. The comrades who shared the position of Bauer, he wrote, quote, maintained that there were two roads to socialism, that of democracy and that of dictatorship. We prefer democracy for the countries of Europe, apart from Russia. But what is to be done if this road is closed to us? Are we to interpret Bauer's position to mean that in that case too, quote, well, In that case, we too, quote, will take the road of violence, dictatorship, and terror, which entices great masses of workers in all countries, end quote. Kautsky. There is no doubt that if we are deprived of democracy, that's not the end quote. Fuck. That's the quote of Bauer. Within Trotsky's quote. So this is Trotsky speaking again. There is no doubt that if we are deprived of democracy as the result of a fascist government, we must struggle, and we will struggle against this regime with all our might. We'll meet violence with violence, ... But towards what aim will we exert all our strength to bring down fascism? Will we act to replace fascism with another dictatorship through which we can allegedly construct socialism? ... If we are strong enough to overthrow fascism, then we will command sufficient strength to reintroduce the democracy destroyed by fascism. There is no doubt that we will be stronger in our struggle against fascism if our goal is to replace fascism with democracy than if our goal is to replace one dictatorship with yet another. A working class that lacks the strength and capacity to hold itself together and reconquer democracy will also be unable to build socialism, which is a much more difficult task than the simple establishment of democracy, in which all the toiling masses have a most passionate interest, even the non-socialist masses, ... I assert that for us there are not many roads to socialism, but only one, that of democracy. When this road is closed to us, we must reopen it before we can take to the road of socialism, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky's conflicts with Dan and Abramovich complemented and extended his polemic with Bauer. Since socialism could be achieved only through democracy, the Bolshevik dictatorship was not socialist and could not prepare socialism. It was, on the contrary, an anti-socialist force. Just one thought, I want to look up Fyodor Dan. Fyodor Dan lived from 1871 to 1947. Original surname Gurvich, was a Russian political activist and journalist who helped found the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And Abramovich. Wikipedia says Raphael Abramovich, who lived from 1880 to 1963, is best known as Raphael Abramovich, was a Russian socialist, a member of the General Jewish Workers' Union in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, the Bund, and a leader of the Menshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Abramovich emigrated from Soviet Russia in 1920, landing in Berlin, where he was a co-founder of the long-running Menshevik journal, the Socialist Courier. After 1940, with the rise of fascism in Europe, he made his way to the United States, where he lived his final years. Wikipedia says, the Socialist Courier, or Socialist Herald, was a newspaper established by the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Mensheviks, that lasted from 1921 to 1965. The Socialist Courier was successively published in Berlin, Paris, and New York City. The first editors included Julius Martov, Fyodor Dan, Raphael Abramovich. The newspaper featured correspondents who lived in the Soviet Union, mainly Mensheviks. All right, so forgive me for that little detour. Hence Kautsky's refusal to consider the Soviet regime as anything but an enemy to be destroyed. In no case could the Soviet regime be regarded as a reality to be defended, even if only conditionally, against the danger of, quote, counter-revolution. Quote, the disagreement between Dan and myself, end quote, Kautsky wrote in 1925, quote, centers on the following claims by Dan. 1. An insurrection against the present regime in Russia could favor only the counter-revolution, inevitably damaging the cause of the proletariat.
2. A victorious insurrection against the present regime in Russia is anyway out of the question, end quote. Kautsky rejected the assumption underlying the first of Dan's theses that, quote, the Bolshevik regime today remains, despite all our reservations, a revolutionary and proletarian regime, end quote. Dan arrived at this conclusion, Kautsky said, because Dan considered the Bolshevik regime a, quote, child of the revolution, end quote. But the decisive criterion for a realistic and concrete assessment of the regime cannot be whether or not it was a child of the revolution. Kautsky did not at all deny Bolshevism's parentage. Indeed, Kautsky fully acknowledged Bolshevism's parentage, but Kautsky maintained that the pertinent criterion of judgment was the evolution and consolidation of Bolshevism. The Soviet regime, Kautsky argued, had now been transformed into a repressive bureaucratic apparatus that reduced the proletariat to a, quote, mass without rights, ruled by a clique commanding a well-disciplined bureaucracy, army, and police, end quote. Bolshevism was therefore no longer to be counted among the revolutionary forces of socialism. Bolshevism was not even a, quote, Jacobin force. Rather, Bolshevism was openly Bonapartist. This was a reality which now had to be confronted. Quote, the revolutionaries themselves, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, have assumed the functions of the counter-revolution, end quote. Under these conditions, there were no grounds to fear that the overthrow of the Bolshevik regime would open the door to the counter-revolution, since the regime itself was the counter-revolution. Hence, quote, the destruction of Bolshevism can no longer produce a counter-revolution. Rather, the destruction of Bolshevism can lead much more rapidly to overcoming counter-revolution, end quote. Kautsky. What year was that? 1925. In 1925, Kautsky did not exclude the possibility that the Bolshevik dictatorship could be removed by an internal, quote, reformist process. If the rising tensions within Bolshevism gave the proletariat the strength and the chance to sustain an opposition determined to alter the status quo, which is also the hope of Fyodor Dan, But even at that time, he refused to exclude the option of insurrection, i.e. the, quote, revolutionary road, rejecting the argument that this would necessarily assume a counter-revolutionary significance. Kautsky wrote, quote, I would resolutely oppose any socialist policy in Russia that took the position insurrection at any price. Only insurrection can liberate us. Any other road is useless. I consider such an attitude as senseless as the opposite point of view, in no case insurrection, since it would lead inevitably to counter-revolution, ... Whoever considers the possibility of a gradual liquidation of the dictatorship in Russia must also consider the possibility of its unexpected collapse, end quote. Kautsky, 1925. At the beginning of the 30s, when Stalinist power was consolidated and industrialization and forced collectivization were underway in the USSR, Kautsky's hostility became even more pronounced. Kautsky declared that Kautsky now excluded any possibility of democratization through a, quote, reform within the Bolshevik system affected by an opposition that would not confront the regime head-on. Trotsky also abandoned the notion of reform in 1933. As early as 1921, in his writing on Georgia, Kautsky had pointed to the road of rebellion against Bolshevism as a third possibility, apart from the maintenance of the, quote, new absolutism, end quote, born of the revolution, or, quote, reaction, supported by the Entente powers. This rebellion, Kautsky believed, would have to be led by the Mensheviks and would represent, quote, the overcoming of Muscovite Bonapartism from within through the strengthening of the movement for liberty of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Now, however, Kautsky lent this revolt a more precise content. The revolt's necessary mode of operation expression, he said, was popular insurrection. The venerable theorist had never tired of tolling the death knell of the Soviet regime from its very inception. Kautsky spoke of the necessity and possibility of an anti-Bolshevik revolt because he was convinced that the collapse of Bolshevism was inevitable in any event. discussing the USSR, Kautsky now used tones similar to those of his predictions of the ineluctable end of capitalism during his early, quote, radical period, where in the past he had counterposed the political and social authoritarianism of the bourgeoisie to the nascent reality of socialism and democracy. He now set the same ideals against Bolshevik despotism, but he was fully persuaded that only a system of social and political administration, different from both capitalism and the Soviet regime, could satisfy the pressing needs of humanity. In Terrorism and Communism, for example, Kautsky prophesied the, quote, collapse of Bolshevism at a time when workers' control and workers' councils had given way to a bureaucratic dictatorship in the economy. Quote, it is true that the new economic dictatorship functions somewhat better than the economic anarchy which preceded it, and which had led even more rapidly to catastrophe. But the dictatorship has merely deferred and not averted this catastrophe, because the new economic bureaucracy is also powerless to organize economic life. End quote. Kautsky, a few years later in Von der Demokratie zur Staatsslavery, I guess that's from democracy to state slavery, Kautsky reiterated this, quote, prophecy, with its usual combination of certainty and indeterminacy. Quote, we must count on the collapse of the communist dictatorship in the foreseeable future. It is not possible to predict the precise date. It can happen overnight, or it may be a long time coming, which is more probable. But one thing is certain, Bolshevism has exhausted its possibilities and has entered Bolshevism's declining phase, whose evolution will be increasingly rapid. End quote. Kautsky. Let me make sure I'm saying that right. I think that is From Democracy to State Slavery. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Von der Demokratie, yeah, from democracy to state slavery. That's what that means. Where the hell am I? A few years later, in From Democracy to State Slavery, Von der Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei, Kautsky reiterated this, quote, prophecy with its usual combination of certainty and indeterminacy. Quote, we must count on the collapse of the communist dictatorship in the foreseeable future. It is not possible to predict the precise date. It can happen overnight, or it may be a long time coming, which is more probable. But one thing is certain, Bolshevism has exhausted Bolshevism's possibilities and has entered its declining phase, whose evolution will be increasingly rapid. End quote. Kautsky. From Democracy to State Slavery. 10 years later, in 1931, when the USSR was advancing forced industrialization and the perspectives of the first five-year plan, Kautsky repeated his prediction of economic disaster once more, again, on the grounds that Russia would be unable to accelerate its development sufficiently without political and social democracy. Kautsky, along with certain Mensheviks, claimed that the, quote, five-year plan must necessarily fail, since no economic effort can prevail over the terror. On the contrary, the necessary condition for any economic improvement in Russia is greater freedom of movement for the masses through a democratization of the state, end quote. Kautsky. Eine Ergänzung. In Arbeiterzeitung, March 1931. Just want to translate that real quick. In addition, it's that's what eine Ergänzung means. And I believe Arbeiterzeitung means like the workers' times. Anyway, in his book Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, which translates as what? Bolshevism in a Dead End. In his book Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, Bolshevism in a Dead End, published in 1930, Kautsky traced out a detailed program for the, quote, democratic revolution, end quote, in Russia and for the prospects of the struggle against Bolshevism. The program's general thrust was directed towards two main objectives. One, the reconquest of the freedom of movement of the proletariat and of political democracy without class limitations. Two, the formation of an economic system that would correspond to the level of productive forces in Russia. Since Kautsky considered the original sin of the Bolsheviks to have been their voluntaristic violation of the necessary interconnections between the forces of production, the relations of production, and political and institutional superstructures, Kautsky held that it would be indispensable to recompose the unity of these factors by simultaneously broadening the sphere of political and social democracy and restricting the sphere of an irrational and inefficient economic collectivization. Posing the question of tactics in the struggle against the Bolshevik regime, Kautsky started from the assumption that the slogan of the, quote, democratization of the Soviets, end quote, while intrinsically invalid, since democracy was universal or nothing, and Sovietism had become the expression of a, quote, aristocratic and particularist power, could nevertheless be a useful weapon in the struggle against the arbitrary power of the bureaucracy. Quote, the democratization of the Soviets, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, is an absurd idea which cannot replace our demand for democracy for all. Nevertheless, it may still be of some historical importance. Given the mounting bankruptcy of the Soviet system, it might rally a section of the Russian proletariat more rapidly and easily than the demand for universal suffrage. Man is conservative by nature, and even when he acts in a revolutionary manner, he likes, at least when he wants, not simply to destroy reality, but to create reality anew, to cling to what exists in order to transform it. Thus, democratization of the Soviets might become one of the levers for bringing the communist reign to an end. Should such a demand arise spontaneously, it would be useful to support it, end quote. Kautsky was convinced that the slogan of the, quote, democratization of the Soviets, end quote, would in practice, because of its own contradictions, lead to a struggle for democracy without class restriction. Quote, its importance lies in the fact that its incoherence would drive it beyond itself towards total democracy, end quote. Kautsky. Bolshevism in the Dead End. Thus, quote, if necessary, we can use the demand, quote, democratization of the Soviets, end quote, as a, quote, transition to total democracy, but in no case could we accept it as an element to be, quote, substituted, end quote, for this democracy, end quote. Kautsky, Bolshevism in a Dead End. But what forces could undertake the struggle against the dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party? Because of the tensions generated by forced collectivization, Kautsky considered a peasant revolt possible, but Kautsky emphasized the inability of the peasantry to reorganize the social and political structure of Russia as a whole. The most the peasants could do would be to spark off a wider revolt. Quote, peasants in rebellion have been able to achieve lasting and important results when the peasants have been allied with the city, but not without the city, and still against the city, end quote. Kautsky. The future of the, quote, democratic revolution lay in the attitude of the proletariat, and in particular the capacity of the workers to break with the status of privileged class, which the Bolsheviks had conferred to the workers in order to consolidate the Bolsheviks' own more extensive and substantial privileges. Quote, everything, Kautsky wrote, quote, will depend on this, whether the workers understand that their privileges are illusory and deceptive, that the proletariat cannot forge chains for the other oppressed classes without these being used against itself, and that they can create lasting liberty for themselves only by creating lasting liberty for all. The proletariat in Russia can win only by renouncing its privileges. It is true that these privileges may indeed render the proletariat somewhat less miserable than the other layers of the population in the countryside, but they prevent the end of the general misery which is constantly extended by the Soviet system, end quote. Kautsky. It is further necessary, Kautsky continued, The intellectuals unite with workers and peasants, since the wage workers and peasants alone, quote, are not yet capable of founding a state without intellectuals, end quote. Kautsky. Bolshevism in a dead end. The common ground of the three classes could only be democracy as a sole satisfactory method for regulating their mutual relations. The aim, then, of the, quote, democratic revolution must be to resume the path that had been interrupted in October 1917. Quote, only one perspective can put a rapid end to chaos and immediately assure the Russian masses the peace, liberty, and security for which they yearn, a union of workers of the city, intellectuals of democratic socialist convictions, and peasants to realize elections to a new constituent assembly charged with drafting a constitution for a democratic parliamentary republic, end quote. Kautsky. Bolshevism in a dead end. Kautsky thought that if the, quote, democratic revolution occurred in Russia, no force could be strong enough to constitute a government by itself. Quote, for the establishment of democracy, all the various elements must collaborate in a united manner, or at least the various socialist parties, end quote. Kautsky. The program of such a coalition government would inevitably have to reflect the fact that Russia was not yet ripe for socialist production and planning. Parenthesis, for Kautsky, of course, Soviet collectivization and planning were signs of socio-economic immaturity. Since Soviet collectivization and planning, despotic apparatus of controls, operated by coercion to extract surplus value through, quote, state slavery, end quote, for the benefit of a, quote, privileged caste, end quote, of ruling bureaucrats and of military officers who secured the system. In many respects, this program recalled that which he had outlined for, quote, Russian democracy in April 1917, which in turn re-echoed the program he had drafted during the period of the First Russian Revolution of 1905. A democratic bourgeoisie could no longer have any real base in Russia, Kautsky said. Weak even before the revolution, the bourgeoisie had now perforce disappeared. There remained, he argued, a non-social. There remained, Kautsky argued, non-socialist Democrats who had, quote, no faith in socialist production, end quote. Parenthesis, a skepticism reinforced by the, quote, failure, end quote, of Bolshevism, end parenthesis. But it could be assumed that these Democrats were not actually anti-socialists and might even be prepared to extend the working class all necessary cooperation on the basis of a realistic economic program. One of the major faults of the Bolsheviks had been a social policy that was generally inferior to that of the capitalist countries. One of the tasks of Russian democracy would be to bring social legislation and the living standards of the working class up to the level of, quote, certain countries of the West, end quote, in respect of essential consumption and freedom of expression and organization. In industry, Kautsky called for the creation of a mixed economy, partly socialized and partly capitalist, designed to restore creative initiative in its various sectors. This would be a, quote, new NEP, end quote. Quote, how should a democratic regime treat the large-scale industrial properties that have already been socialized by the Soviet state? Does the democratic program require that they be purely and simply consigned to capitalists, since Russia is not yet ripe for socialist production? End quote. Kautsky. This, Kautsky replied, quote, would be a measure as insane as this measure's opposite, the unplanned and forced socialization undertaken by the Bolsheviks, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky argued that it was necessary to preserve the socialized sectors, but it was equally necessary to cure them of the irrationality of coercion and of executive passivity. It was therefore necessary to introduce a high degree of, quote, freedom of economic action, end quote. This could be done by leaving room for the development of competitive enterprises organized in a non-socialist sector composed of, quote, free capitalist, cooperative, and communal enterprises, end quote. Kautsky. Quote, if these enterprises, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, achieve better results, supply cheaper or superior products, pay higher wages, and so on, then the state enterprises should be abandoned, but not before. The transition to another form of organization, which might possibly even be capitalist, must only occur when and where it is advantageous for consumers and workers. End quote. Kautsky. Kautsky predicted the state sector would draw great advantage from the emergence of political liberty and, quote, freedom of action. Workers, trade unions, workers' councils, and factory directors would all be able, after bureaucratic domination and control were abolished, to contribute to ensuring that state production profitably embraced a broad sector. At the same time, Kautsky called for the reversion of commerce to private ownership, since, quote, most branches of trade are not easily adapted to bureaucratic schematization, end quote. In Kautsky's view, the nationalization of trade would not assist, quote, socialist production, which needed not so much the, quote, nationalization of the exchange of products as its, quote, replacement by an organization for circulating products among associations of producers and consumers, end quote. Kautsky, quote, free trade, end quote, should also supplant the monopoly of foreign trade, which had exercised, quote, the most dispiriting effects, end quote, on the Soviet economy. On the other hand, there was no reason to transform, quote, natural monopolies, such as railroads, forests, mines, oil, and similar branches, into private monopolies. Turning the program of a, quote, victorious democratization, end quote, for the land, Kautsky maintained that in principle, quote, we should strive for the nationalization or socialization, end quote, of the soil. But Kautsky held that this problem could not be resolved in a doctrinaire and formalistic spirit. What mattered in practice was the concrete relationship between human labor and the land itself. Where the soil was worked by peasant labor, small-scale producers must be assured of their right of long-term possession with no lingering threats of expropriation. For the Sovkhozy and Kolkhozy, the state and collective farms, the question was posed differently. Where labor had assumed a cooperative and collective character, quote, the individual laborer is not wedded to his labor on a particular plot of land. The Sovkhozy and Kolkhozy can therefore be transferred into social property. In these cases, the social ownership of the soil is important. On peasant holdings, it is not, end quote. Kautsky. Bolshevism in a dead end. In general, the relevant criterion was not formal categories but effective realities, not juridical status but the actual degree of development of the productive forces and the quality of the organization of labor. The Sovkhozy and Kolkhozy that had been created by pure coercion, whose genesis did not correspond to a, quote, internal exigency of the toilers and the material conditions, end quote, should be replaced by peasant forms of production. On the other hand, those which were, quote, technically well equipped, end quote, or which possessed a voluntary labor force with an adequate leadership, should be maintained as collective property. The overall direction of Kautsky's program should now be clear. On the one hand, it sought to, quote, lower a collectivization that did not generally correspond to the actual level of the productive forces and relations of production in Russia, but was simply the expression of the, quote, voluntarist drive for power of the Soviet bureaucracy, executed without regard for human costs, depletion of social resources, or exploitation of the working class and the peasantry, hence, quote, irrational for the collectivity and, quote, rational only for the privileged strata of the, quote, new class, with its despotic machine of political control. On the other hand, the program was intended to, quote, heighten the democratic capacity of all social forces to quicken the economy itself, and so in the long run lay a more solid basis for socialist production, which could be introduced on a large scale once the forces of production had attained much greater maturity.
Kautsky's thesis that Bolshevism could no longer be reformed, that it was now an overtly counter-revolutionary force, which a democratic revolution must overthrow in Russia, provoked further polemics with the Mensheviks Dan and Abramovich. Whereas Kautsky held that the Stalinist regime was a form of consolidated Bonapartism, Don maintained that Stalinism had not created a conservative peasant social order, and that it was politically more similar to Jacobinism than to Bonapartism. To Kautsky's hopes that the forced collectivization might unleash a, quote, new popular revolution, end quote, that would introduce, quote, full democracy, Fyodor Dan objected that if anti-Stalinist uprisings occurred in the countryside, they would not take a revolutionary but a particularist economistic direction. Equally erroneous, Dan argued, was Kautsky's assumption that democratic intellectuals would move towards support of the popular masses, since there were no longer any intellectuals of the type Kautsky imagined in Russia. Footnote. See Fyodor Dan, Probleme der Liquidationsperiode in der Kampf. What the hell? God damn it. Let's see if I can get back to where I was. I accidentally exited out of the PDF. All right. See Fyodor Dan, Probleme der Liquidationsperiode. Which translates as problems of the liquidation period. End footnote. To Kautsky's hopes that forced collectivization might unleash a, quote, new popular revolution that would introduce, quote, full democracy, Dan objected that if anti-Stalinist uprisings occurred in the countryside, they would not take a revolutionary but a particularistic economistic direction. Equally erroneous, Dan argued, was Kautsky's assumption that democratic intellectuals would move towards support of the popular masses, since there were no longer any intellectuals of the type Kautsky imagined in Russia. The only force capable of waging a consistent struggle for democracy in the USSR, Dan wrote, was the working class, which did not want the overthrow of the regime and its replacement by a different order, but rather a transition from, quote, Jacobinism to socialist democracy. In other words, a political transformation that would not put in question the economic system. Abramovich advanced a similar argument. Abramovich lucidly delineated two alternatives, Kautsky's position and the Menshevik position upheld by himself and Don. Those like Kautsky, who were convinced that the objective preconditions for socialism were lacking in the USSR, would inevitably conclude that the Bolshevik experiment was doomed to failure, and therefore that a principled and frontal struggle must be waged against it. Those, on the other hand, who believed that socialism could be introduced in the USSR shifted the terrain of discussion to questions of method, and struggled precisely against the methods of Stalinism. Footnote. See Abramovich, Revolution und Counter-Revolution in Russland, which Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Russia, in Die Gesellschaft, which is the Society. Number 7, 1930. End footnote. Where the hell am I? In sum, for Kautsky, the counter-revolution had been victorious in Russia, and for the Mensheviks there had been a Jacobin revolution that must overcome its limits and become socialist. Quote, whoever is acquainted with the position of Russian social democracy as officially expressed in the writings of Martov knows that we, in contrast to Kautsky, consider Russian Bolshevism a Jacobin and utopian revolution. Revolutionary utopianism or Bonapartism, spurious revolution or genuine counter-revolution. These are the terms of the question
if we are to summarize the antithesis between the conceptions of Kautsky and those of Russian social democracy, end quote. Abramovich. Quote, the Russian Bonapartism of which Kautsky speaks, end quote, Abramovich continued, quote, is a very special phenomenon, since Bolshevism lacks the social base of Bonapartism. Under Bolshevism, there are no classes that could enjoy the fruits of the revolution in lasting manner or could constitute a stable social counterweight, end quote. Raphael Abramovich, 1930. Finally, Abramovich emphasized that when Kautsky appealed for a general insurrection against the Stalinist regime, he was reckoning without the enemy. In other words, he was underestimating the repressive power of the Soviet state, the only realistic perspective against a centralized machine as highly organized as the Stalinist regime was a link-up of the popular and proletarian movement with one wing of forces engaged in an internal struggle within the dictatorship. Kautsky replied by explaining the reasons why he considered the perspectives of his, quote, Menshevik friends, end quote, erroneous. The Mensheviks, he wrote, consider the Bolshevik regime, quote, a revolutionary regime whose methods they do not share but whose overthrow could endanger the entire revolution. For them, the problem is to prevent the violent overthrow of the regime and to modify the regime's methods in a democratic direction. I, contrary to them, have arrived at the conviction that the apparatus of the Bolshevik government is no longer acting in the direction of the revolution, but rather is proceeding to ruin the conquest of the revolution. It thereby assumes the function of the counter-revolution, end quote. Kautsky. So far, Kautsky was merely repeating his traditional views. Kautsky's conclusion, however, was new, for he now declared that, quote, the effort to reform the dictatorship in a democratic direction without a violent uprising of the popular masses is hopeless, end quote. Kautsky, Sozialdemokratie und Bolschewismus. In an article published in the Vienna Arbeiterzeitung in March 1931, Kautsky dealt explicitly with the problem of the political basis of the struggle to realize the program of the, quote, democratic revolution in Russia. Kautsky's arguments were to provoke another major polemic, this time with Fritz Adler. Kautsky referred to the accusations at the recent Moscow trials against the Mensheviks, repeated in the international communist press, that the positions he had set out in Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, Bolshevism in a dead end, represented an active preparation of armed insurrection against Bolshevik state power. Kautsky asserted that this was a deliberate falsification. He had, he said, quote, always opposed any state intervention against Soviet Russia and any preparation of armed insurrection in that country, end quote. The question was wholly different. It was a matter of attempting to promote artificial insurrections, but rather of not a matter of attempting to promote artificial insurrections, but rather of determining political options in the event that internal social tensions in the USSR spontaneously provoked a popular armed insurrection against Stalinist despotism. This was where real positions parted company. Quote, what position should be taken in that event, end quote, Kautsky asked. Quote, would it then be the duty of the International to call upon Russian Social Democrats to ally themselves against the workers and peasants in revolt against Stalin and his instruments? Is it really true that anyone who revolts against this abominable regime is a, quote, white guard, or is acting in the service of the white guards? This is what we are discussing. It is something completely different from whether or not we should advocate foreign intervention and foment insurrections, end quote. Kautsky went on to say that he did not believe, as some of his social democratic friends did, that there was any, quote, possibility of putting an end to Stalinist terror peacefully, end quote, as improvements in the economic situation would someday render it superfluous. The degree of tension caused by the ideological conflict between Kautsky on the one side and Otto Bauer and Fritz Adler on the other over their differing assessments of Stalinist Russia was shown in 1933 by the editorial note with which Der Kampf accompanied an article by Kautsky entitled Demokratie und Diktatur, devoted precisely to the opinions of Bauer and his followers. The journal remarked that some of the judgments of the, quote, old master, quote, especially in regard to Soviet Russia, end quote, were, quote, in quite sharp contrast, end quote, to the judgments of the editorial board and of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. In his article, Kautsky reaffirmed his familiar view of the connection between democracy and socialism. Kautsky rejected the claim that democracy represented a road to the goal of socialism, but that did not itself constitute the goal, and that a non-democratic road to socialism was therefore conceivable. Quote, democracy, Kautsky countered, quote, is not merely a road to the socialist goal, but is a component of the goal itself. A component of the goal itself, end quote, Kautsky. Equally mistaken, Kautsky argues, was another conception that was current in the ranks of social democracy, namely that, quote, true democracy is possible only in a socialist society, end quote, whereas, quote, present democracy is only a fraud or only formal, end quote. End quote, Kautsky. On the contrary, Kautsky wrote, democracy, even in a bourgeois framework, was of maximum importance, even though it was only partial, since it was only by making use of it that the proletariat could organize itself as a class and attain the strength and maturity necessary to bring democracy to completion by lending it a socialist foundation. Hence, quote, democracy is indissolubly linked to socialism at once as the road to the goal and as an element of the goal, end quote. Kautsky. Demokratie und Diktatur, Der Kampf, 26, 1933. Replying to this article, Friedrich Adler advanced a series of objections to Kautsky's position, which dramatized the divergences within international social democracy over the issues of Bolshevism, the USSR, the international communist movement, and especially the urgent question of the united front in the struggle against fascism. In the course of the controversy, Kautsky declared his complete opposition to any united front with communists guided from Moscow, since it was impossible to forge a united front between, quote, democracy and dictatorship, end quote. Treating ideological differences as a supreme criterion, Kautsky denied that the common social base of social democracy and communist workers had any political significance whatever. Kautsky declared that a united front was possible and desirable only if the communists in effect adopted social democratic positions. Adler objected that Kautsky's outlook on the USSR and the United Front was alien to the Socialist International. Indeed, Adler argued Kautsky shared the standpoint of the Zarya Menshevik minority, which the International had refused to accept into its ranks. This might be referring to the Nasha Zarya, meaning Our Dawn in English, which was a legal Menshevik monthly published in St. Petersburg, Russia from 1910 to 1914. Lenin described Nasha Zarya as the, quote, liquidators' center in Russia. Nasha Zarya was started by the organizing committee, a leading Menshevik center. Back to the text. What joined Kautsky to the Potrasevs and Ingermans of the, quote, Zarya group was not that these people advocated foreign intervention against the Soviet Union, a position which Kautsky did not share, but that they, like Kautsky, did not understand what an uprising against the Bolshevik state, whether internal or external, would create an imminent danger of counter-revolution. I'm going to look up these people, the Patrusevs and Ingermans. Patrusev, Menshevik. I don't know if this is the right person, but it looks like they might be referring to someone who Alexander Petrusov, who lived from 1869 to 1934. Alexander Petrusov was a Russian Social Democratic politician and one of the leaders of the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He was one of 6 original editors of the newspaper Iskra. Under the pen name Starover. In 1918, the Bolsheviks arrested Petrusov for his involvement in the Union for the Salvation of Russia, a group uniting right-wing Mensheviks, SRs, and popular socialists, I guess is what the committee he's referring to is, which he later regretted. It says, in 1918, the Bolsheviks arrested Patrusov for his involvement in that committee. In 1925, he was permitted to leave Soviet Russia for medical reasons. He lived first in Berlin, then in Paris, battling illness. Patrusov viewed the Soviet Union not as a socialist state, but as a thoroughly reactionary oligarchy, a point of view that alienated him from most Mensheviks. He contributed regularly to Alexander Kerensky's journal titled Days. He expected the imminent collapse of communism and urged all anti-Bolshevik forces to unite. Petrusov died in Paris on the 11th of July, 1934, as a consequence of an operation. He was buried at the Père Lachaise Cemetery. Okay, so that's Petrusov. Let's see who Ingerman is. Wikipedia says Sergius Ingerman lived from 1868 to 1943 and was a Russian-born Jewish-American socialist and physician. I don't know if this is even the right guy. It might not be. There's also an Anna Ingerman, who lived from 1868 to 1931 and was a Russian-born Jewish-American physician and prominent socialist. She was a founding member of the Socialist Party of America and ran for office in New York City as a Socialist Party candidate several times, but was never elected. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the same, if this person is the person either, so keep all those in brackets. The decisive question, Adler maintained, was not whether the Soviet regime was good or otherwise, but whether the Soviet regime's existence should be defended or not. Here Adler brought the essence of the conflict into focus. while the majority of the Socialist International accepted the fact of the USSR and sought to favor the USSR's transformation in a more democratic direction, Kautsky, convinced of the inevitability and utility of the collapse of Bolshevism, held that it should be abandoned to the condemnation history was about to pronounce on it. The Soviet regime had been born prematurely. On this, the Adlers and the Kautskys agreed. But the former sought to aid its survival and development, while the later judged that it was an abortion to be disposed of as rapidly as possible. Here, Adler wrote, is, quote, the decisive point, wherein there is but one inescapable alternative. Despite all that arouses our disgust, despite the abandonment of all illusions, such as the notion that socialism has already been achieved in the Soviet Union, or that its achievement is now quite close. In short, despite all the negative elements, of which we are well aware and which we have never tried to conceal, do we want to foster the possibilities of survival of the Soviet Union, to aid the Soviet Union, to the extent we are able, or do we want to abandon the Soviet Union to the Soviet Union's fate, i.e., not prepare any blows against the Soviet Union, but also not do anything to protect such blows from being prepared, because we are convinced of its inevitable collapse? End quote. Fritz Adler, Zur Diskussion über Sowjet-Russland, ein Briefwechsel mit, maybe it's Wechsel, mit Karl Kautsky. Is that open letter to Karl Kautsky? I think Brief or Brief. An exchange of letters with Karl Kautsky. I knew that brief meant letters. End footnote. We're back to the text, end footnote. Consistent with his positive assessment of the potentially socialist nature of the socioeconomic basis of the USSR, Adler condemned Kautsky's call for the return of certain sectors of the Soviet economy to capitalism, precisely because Fritz Adler believed that the Soviet regime contained genuine germs of socialism. Fritz Adler insisted that a, quote, new civil war, end quote, in the USSR could assume no other character than that of an insurrection against socialism, which would involve, quote, the danger of a return of the old forces of the constitution of a counter-revolutionary dictatorship, end quote, and would certainly not pave the way for a democratic socialist development. Fritz Adler also rejected Kautsky's, quote, democratic fetishism, the claim that there was no other road to socialism than democracy. This fetishism, Adler remarks, was a mere doctrinaire abstraction parallel to that of the Bolsheviks, who believed that there was no other road to socialism than dictatorship. Finally, Adler indicated that it was possible for social democrats and communists to achieve a united front on the basis of their common interest in socialism, regardless of their conflicts over strategy. Adler's position deserves to be quoted in full as a forceful expression of the attitude of Austrian social democracy to the United Front. Quote, there are two reference points that represent the minimum basis for unity between social democrats and Bolsheviks, without which agreement is unthinkable. ... 1. The Bolsheviks must acknowledge that the democratic road to socialism is not excluded, at least in certain countries, Scandinavia, for example, end parentheses. 2. The socialists must recognize that it is not excluded that Soviet Russia, without returning to private capitalism, may achieve socialism from the starting point of its present situation. End quote. Fritz Adler. Kautsky's responses were wholly negative. On the most urgent practical matter of the United Front, Kautsky rejected Adler's positions as liable to introduce a cleavage between the theory and practice of social democracy. In effect, Adler was asking Western communists to renounce the very reasons for the Western communist existence. In other words, to acknowledge that what had been good for Russia might not be good for developed Europe. Adler was also ignoring the reality of the incessant struggle between socialists and communists, which had certainly not been caused by Kautsky's articles, but reflected an irreconcilable conflict to which Kautsky merely attested. Quote, I am equally and firmly convinced, end quote. Kautsky wrote to Adler on the 10th of January 1933, on the eve of Hitler's seizure of power in Germany, quote, that the formation of a united front is our most important task. If I believed it even remotely possible that my article, bracket, Demokratie und Diktatur, and bracket, would prevent this front, I would renounce it immediately. Bracket, his letter was written before the publication of the article, end bracket. But in life, as in politics, practice speaks louder than theoretical dissertations. The daily brawls between our people and the communists are rather greater obstacles to the proletarian united front than is a theoretical article in Der Kampf. When our daily press is compelled day after day to stigmatize the communists as deceitful liars lacking any conscience, this has a much greater effect on the masses than my article. There is no future in drawing a line separating Russia from the rest of the world and saying that we want unity with the Russian dictatorship, but that we combat the communists in our own country. Furthermore, I must note once again that my article says nothing new about the International and the Stalinists. That I now say to the Austrians that what I have already said to others cannot constitute a fresh obstacle to the United Front. I maintain that the proletarian united front is very necessary, but for me this is not tantamount to a unified front between democracy and dictatorship. Such a front seems to me neither useful nor possible. The Russian dictators will always reject it. The experiences we have already had in this domain speak for themselves. Only when the dictatorship in Russia is supplanted by democracy will the obstacles that have prevented agreement with the communists up to now be removed, end quote. Kautsky. Letter from Kautsky to Fritz Adler, January 1933. Right? Yeah. Kautsky reasserted his conviction that a grave crisis would erupt in the USSR in the coming spring because of the enormous difficulties there. This explained one of the decisive aspects of Kautsky's attitude. Predicting the possibility of a collapse of the Soviet state, Kautsky was not inclined to seek an agreement with any enemy that was about to fall, particularly since he was looking forward with faith and hope to a, quote, democratic, anti-Bolshevik insurrection from within, end parenthesis. Adler had appealed to the resolutions of the Socialist International and the attitude of social democracy toward the Soviet Union. The aged theoretician retorted by invoking the right of minorities to dissent. Quote, you say, end quote, he replied to Adler, quote, that there is no particular problem about my views on Russia, but that there are clear resolutions of international congresses. Roma locuta est causa finita. What the fuck does that mean? These resolutions express only what the majority thought at the time the resolutions were voted. They do not prohibit discussion of them by the minority, end quote. Kautsky to Fritz Adler. Roma locuta est causa finita is a Latin phrase that means Rome has spoken, the matter is settled. It is a legal principle that comes from canon law. A few days before these last words were written, Kautsky had declared, again in a letter to Fritz Adler, in tones somewhere between arrogance and pathos, that on the question of the Soviet Union and the communists, Kautsky was prepared to be the Cassandra of social democracy. Quote, "If I remain isolated, then dixi et salvavi, animam mien." Cassandra remained isolated too, but at least she was not gagged. I don't know what the hell that means. I don't know who Cassandra is either. Cassandra, or Cassandra, sometimes referred to as Alexandra, in Greek mythology was a Trojan priestess dedicated to the god Apollo and fated by Apollo to utter true prophecies but never be believed. In modern usage, Cassandra's name is employed as a rhetorical device to indicate a person whose accurate prophecies, generally of impending disaster, are not believed. Cassandra was a daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. Her elder brother was Hector, the hero of Greek-Trojan War. The older and most common versions of the myth state that she was admired by the god Apollo, who sought to win her love by means of the gift of seeing the future. According to Aeschylus, Cassandra promised him her favors, but after receiving the gift she went back on her words. As the enraged Apollo could not revoke a divine power, he added to it the curse that nobody would believe her prophecies. In other sources, such as Hyginus and Pseudo-Apollodorus, Cassandra broke no promise to Apollo, but rather the power of foresight was given to her as an enticement to enter a romantic engagement, the curse being added only when it failed to produce the results desired by the god. Later versions, on the contrary, describe Cassandra falling asleep in a temple where snakes licked or whispered into her ears, which enabled her to hear the future. Back to the text. New section. Against the Popular Fronts. Having rejected the United Front of the Communists in 1932-33, Kautsky also rejected the line of the Popular Front launched by the 7th Congress of the Communist International in 1935. This was the last battle waged by Kautsky shortly before his death in 1938. The thrust of his attack was that a, quote, united front with the Communists would be possible only if they abandoned the terrain of dictatorship and returned to that of democracy. Otherwise, any unity between the Social Democrats and Communists would simply be a contradiction in terms. The orientation of social democracy was and could only be opposition to any sort of dictatorship. The struggle against fascism was merely one aspect of such opposition. The second aspect was opposition to the, quote, red dictatorship in Russia. Here again, Kautsky clashed with his friend Otto Bauer, agreeing that the problem of a united front between social democrats and communists was critical in combating fascism. He held that the nature of communism was such as to prevent any solution of it. In the course of this last sortie against communism, Kautsky recapitulated his theses on the origin, development, and nature of the Soviet Union, concentrating on his, quote, 20-year-long disagreement, end quote, with Otto Bauer. The latter, in an article reviewing the recently published book, Stalin, Critical History of Bolshevism, I think is the subtitle, Aperçu historique du Bolchevisme, by Boris Souvarin, objected to any assessment of Stalin's role in the Soviet regime that depicted the Russian chief merely as a malevolent demiurge. Responding to Bauer, Kautsky noted that there was no contradiction between an analysis that characterized the apex of power in the USSR as a personal dictatorship and an analysis that emphasized the importance of social conditions. To speak of Stalin's role as an omnipotent dictator did not mean to fall into a sort of idealism. On the contrary, the problem was to correlate the general social and political conditions with the personal dictatorship in Russia. In fact, it had been inevitable that the dictatorship of the Communist Party would be transformed into a one-man dictatorship, not just of any man, but of the man who was the worst of all the top-ranking leaders. Bolshevism, Kautsky affirmed, was not a historic necessity in Russia. On the contrary, Bolshevism represented the triumph of one possibility over others. The retrogressive process Bolshevism represented had been set in motion the moment it had given Bolshevism an organizational configuration which, against Marxism, had reintroduced Blanchism into the workers' movement. Lenin's line had triumphed with the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and was reflected in the dictatorship of the party. If the communists, Kautsky continued, now wanted a united front with social democracy to combat fascism, had sought a, quote, united front at the origin of the Soviet state, then, quote, Russia would have been spared 3 decades of civil war and the consequent horrible misery, end quote. Quote, without dictatorship, without terror, end quote. Through the democracy of the workers and peasants, anything would have been possible. Once the road of the dictatorship of an armed minority over the majority had been taken, an inevitable process was set in motion. Quote, this dictatorship inevitably degenerated from the dictatorship of a party to the dictatorship of an individual over the party and the state, end quote. It's funny because that's like basically almost verbatim what Trotsky says in Our Political Tasks. I think that's what it's called, from the early 1900s. Which individual? Precisely the man, quote, who was the weakest intellectually and the most brutal morally, the least guided by conscience, even though he was also the shrewdest and most cunning, end quote. Stalin had been the true subjective interpreter of the objective conditions created during the period prior to his rise to power. Exploiting the degradation of democracy that had already occurred during the Leninist period, Stalin had possessed the brutality and acuity needed to demolish the facade of popular power and led the substance of despotism its appropriate form. That form was precisely a personal dictatorship. He had thus been able simultaneously to interpret and to sublimate the contradictions of Leninism in a new synthesis. Footnote, The United Front, published in The New Leader, January 4th, 1936. Bauer had written that whatever the reservations to be made about its political methods, Soviet industrialization had undeniably been a great historical success. Kautsky reproached Bauer for having halted economistically at the objective fact of industrialization and then arbitrarily imparting a progressive significance to it as an advance towards socialism. The procedure, Kautsky charged, was gratuitous. There was no reason to hail industrialization in itself, Kautsky said. It must be kept in mind that the, quote, constructive program implemented under Stalin is not at all unprecedented, end quote, and that its antecedents, given the forms in which the program had been realized, were those of capitalist industrialization. Stalinist, like capitalist industrialization, had been realized through the indiscriminate exploitation of the broad masses. To confer on Soviet industrialization the label of socialism, albeit of a violent and brutal variety as Bauer did, was to be diluted by an ideological nominalism. From the standpoint of socialism, technical and economic innovations had to be viewed in relation to their human and social consequences. Quote, Bauer, Kautsky wrote, quote, sees only the construction of plants and collectives, but fails to grasp the rise of a new aristocracy that controls these new means of production and exploits them for its own purposes, end quote. Quote, Bauer, Kautsky wrote, quote, sees only the construction of plants and collectives, but fails to grasp the rise of a new aristocracy that controls these new means of production and exploits them for its own purposes, end quote. an aristocracy of which Stalin was the natural chief. Now, Kautsky sarcastically observed, quote, Otto Bauer considers this the rise of a classless society, end quote. Could a greater blunder be imagined? The point of view of Bauer and those who followed Bauer was not Marxist. Lecturing Bauer in Marxism, Kautsky denounced objectivist materialism as a fetishism of technique which had nothing to do with Marxism. Those who concentrated their regard on technique alone and thought that the installation of machinery amounted to the introduction of socialism were close to ideological bankruptcy. Quote, Marx knew that the human factors are decisive in society, end quote. That technique is significant for socialism only when it develops under specific and appropriate social relations. Soviet industrialization was a process of primitive accumulation of capital at the expense of the masses, primarily the peasants. The political and social relations of that accumulation took the form of a violent despotism. Marx held that socialism must be the product of the workers. Bauer, on the other, thought that socialism could be the automatic product of industrialization. Marx maintained that freedom and democracy were simultaneously the preconditions and the necessary form of socialism. Bauer claimed that in the USSR these could be the final products of a despotic state. Where am I? Sorry, lost my spot. Where the hell am I? The leader of Austrian social democracy had thus completely lost sight of the, quote, nature of the Soviet Stalinist regime. It was not a Jacobin government preparing socialism and liberty, but the rule of a new class. Quote, the fruit of Bolshevism, as we have outlined it, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, has been the establishment of a new class regime, end quote, with a purely instrumental relationship to socialist ideology. All those Bolsheviks who opposed the construction of this class regime have been physically eliminated. Quote, not the abolition of all classes, but the replacement of the old classes by new classes. This has been the outcome of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, just like the French Revolution of 1789. Militarized, highly concentrated economy of the Soviet state is certainly radically different from the private capitalist economy, but it is no less different from the objective of the emancipation of the toiling classes from any exploitation and servitude, end quote. What sort of unity was possible in the West, then, between the socialists on the one hand and the communists who saw the Soviet regime as their model on the other hand? What common strategy could there be between those who strove for socialism with democracy and those who strove to reproduce in the West the sort of regime characteristic of Stalinism? Up to now, Kautsky asserted, the results of the frenzied struggle the Western communists had waged against the socialists had been favorable only to the rise of reactionary dictatorships which imitated the political methods of the Stalinist regime. Quote, these are the, quote, successes the working class of the entire world owes the communist dictatorship in Russia, end quote. Kautsky, The United Front in New Leader. Kautsky's attitude to the United Front was in consequence exceedingly rigid. Kautsky held that communists and socialists could find no common ground of agreement, and particularly that the masses of the two wings of the workers' movement could not conduct common struggles, laying their differences aside as, quote, secondary compared to the, quote, principal conflict between the workers' movement and fascism. The fact is that Kautsky did not at all consider the conflicts between communists and socialists, quote, secondary, and that he clearly lent greater importance to organizations than to relations among the masses. In his old age, the, quote, principal contradiction for Kautsky was between democracy and dictatorship. Hence, Kautsky denied any validity to a united front between communist supporters of dictatorship and democratic socialists. The principal implication of the difference between Bauer and Kautsky were evident. For the former, the quote barbaric socialism of Stalin awaited a future redemption, and the communists were therefore potential allies. For Kautsky, Stalin's regime was a despotism of a new variety. Indeed, it was the statal variant of modern despotism, of which fascism was the capitalist variant. The idea of an agreement between socialists and communists was a contrivance proposed by the latter on the orders of their master in Moscow, vitiated by the fact that the communists conceived of unity not as an autonomous value, but as a tactical a tactical exigency. The communist Kautsky wrote, quote, do not intend to respect the will of the movement as a whole, but reserve themselves the right to turn away to separate action at any moment whenever they want, end quote. Quote, the communists of all countries are the disciplined Praetorian Guard, end quote, of Moscow. Quote, for the present rulers of Russia, communism has become what Pan-Slavism was for the czars, end quote. In conclusion, what the Communist International was proposing was not the autonomous, quote, cooperation of workers seeking a strategy of their own, but the instrumental, quote, cooperation of the Socialist International with the, quote, the world's strongest dictatorship, end quote. Having said all this, Kautsky did not absolutely reject any unity with the communists whatever, but Kautsky opposed rigid conditions. The sort of collaboration that should be established between socialists and communists, Kautsky said, could only be a limited one for specific goals, such as, for example, support to Stalin against Hitler, quote, in the event of war, end quote. What was completely excluded was any strategic alliance between socialists and communists. Two years later, in late 1937, Kautsky took up the same arguments again, this time with reference to the development of the popular fronts and the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, which was then increasingly seeking military agreements with France and Britain and against the threat of Nazi militarism. His hostility to the communists in the USSR had not diminished in the slightest. Indeed, it culminated in a prophecy. Kautsky warned the European workers' movement that the shift of the communists and their, quote, rehabilitation of democracy was merely a maneuver dictated not by any modification of their principles, but once again by obedience to the wishes of their masters in the Kremlin, who now required international accords. So much so, Kautsky declared, that it was not to be excluded that if agreements with France and Britain were not forthcoming, there could be a new volte-face ending in the aberration of a direct Nazi-Soviet understanding and communist denunciation of the warmongering imperialism of the bourgeois democratic countries of the West as the main enemy. The USSR and the communist, Kautsky wrote in one of the last essays of his life, with their contempt for democracy, parenthesis, need it be recalled that by this Kautsky meant parliamentarism and political and civil rights, end parenthesis, had decisively contributed to weakening the workers' movement in many countries, which then fell prey to fascism. Ultimately, this created menacing conditions even for the security of the Soviet state itself, which, quote, is now compelled to appeal for aid from democracy outside Russia, end quote. The USSR, acting through the Third International, had thus given the Communist parties the word, halt the frenzied attacks on democracy and social democracy, and advance proposals for the constitution of a, quote, united front. Despite everything, this could be grounds for satisfaction. Quote, but our satisfaction is somewhat diminished by the fact that this change in the communists is not a modification of principles, but merely a tactical maneuver. They defend democracy only where they are in opposition. They annihilate democracy and enforce the most merciless suppression of popular liberty wherever they are in power, end quote. Kautsky. Was the USSR seeking allies in the West because there were democratic powers there? On the contrary, the Soviet Union was taking a new attitude towards democracy because the allies the Soviet Union needed, quote, can be found only in the democratic states of the West, end quote. Kautsky. Thus, precisely because the, quote, democratic, end quote, turn of the Comintern was rooted not in any shift in principles, but solely in the exigencies of the foreign policy of the USSR, it was necessary to prepare for further surprises. Quote, in the event that the Soviet rulers come to an agreement with Germany and Japan, and communists everywhere will become supporters of fascism. Quote, in the event that the Soviet rulers come to an agreement with Germany and Japan, the communists everywhere will become supporters of fascism, end quote. Kautsky said that he did not consider an agreement between Hitler and Stalin, quote, probable, since too many differences between their two countries militated against this. But Kautsky did insist that the possibility should not be discounted, since the supreme criterion of Soviet policy was the pursuit of power, uncurbed by any obstacle of principle or ideology. The same could be said of Nazism. We must reckon with such changes in Russia as much as in Germany. Despite all this, quote, we must reckon with such changes in Russia as much as in Germany, end quote. Despite all this, Kautsky concluded with an expression of hope that strategic change might occur in the attitude of the communist movement to the importance of democracy for the socialist struggle. Then the proletariat and united front could become a reality. Quote, we have no need of a new program, nor of a new theory of socialism. What we need is a rise in the strength of democracy, a powerful rise that depends only on the communists. One the communists could realize overnight if their leaders were willing. Struggle for democracy in Soviet Russia. This is the slogan for a stable and irresistible united front of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Communists swing far to right in New Tactical Maneuver, published in The New Leader, 27th of November 1937. Sorry, I just want to look up. The New Leader existed from 1924 to 2010 and was an American political and cultural magazine. The New Leader began in 1924 under a group of figures associated with the Socialist Party of America, such as Eugene V. Debs and Norman Thomas. It was published in New York City by the American Labor Conference on International Affairs. Its orientation was liberal and anti-communist. The Tenement Institute was its primary supporter. Its overall politics shifted in its second decade. Quote, under Levitas's editorship, during years when the much higher circulation Nation and New York Public often ran acrobatic apologies for Stalin, the New Leader became a bi-weekly platform for what was then known as liberal anti-communism, end quote. And that quote's from who? Mirsky Yehuda, 2010, Requiem for a Big Little Magazine, published in Jewish Ideas Daily. Its editors, 1924 to 1940, James O'Neill, founding editor, 1936 to 1960, Sol Levitas, managing editor, 1940 to 1960, Sol Levitas, executive editor, 1945 to 1950, Liston M. Oak, managing editor, 1950 to 1960, Suzanne La Follette, managing editor, 1960 to 1961, Myron Kolach, managing editor, 1960 to 2006, Myron Kolach, executive editor. Its contributors were prominent liberal thinkers and artists. The New Leader was the first to publish Joseph Brodsky and Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the United States. I can never pronounce that guy's name. It was one of the first to publish Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. Other contributors who were generally paid nothing or only a modest fee, including James Baldwin, Daniel Bell, Willy Brandt, was the Prime Minister of Germany in like the 70s. David Dallin, who I think was a Menshevik. Yes. Milovan Gilas, the author of The New State. He was a high-ranking member of the Yugoslav Communist Party in the early days. Theodore Draper, the brother of Hal Draper, who wrote a big book on the history of communism. Max Eastman, early champion of Trotsky in the United States. Ralph Ellison, is that the Invisible Man guy? Sidney Hook, Hubert Humphrey, George F. Kennan, Murray Kempton, Irvin Kristol, Melvin Lansky, Richard J. Margolis, Roybin Markham, Claude McKay, C. Wright Mills, Hans Morgenthau, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Albert Murray, Ralph de Toledano, Reinhold Niebuhr, George Orwell, Bertrand Russell, Cyril Joad, Bayard Rustin, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., and Tony Sender. The new leader ceased print publication after the January/2006 double issue. A bi-monthly online version was published from 2007 to 2010. Longtime editor Myron Kolach conducted an interview with Columbia University's The Current in 2007. Myron Kolach mainly discussed the history of journals of ideas, the New Leader, Partisan Review, the New Republic, National Review, and the role in politics and intellectual discourse. Kolach's Who We Are and Where We Came From, adapted from the last print issue, covers some of the same topics. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter. Thank you for listening, and thank you for letting me look up the new leader at the end of it. I think the history of magazines is really, in journals, is really fascinating. Thanks for listening.